Philippe, thank you very much for joining this conversation. As HERE-Geneva, we're preparing for our conference Beyond the Pandemic, What is Next? We're asking the question, how does this pandemic influence the way we work? What changes do we need to make, or have we already made? But particularly, first of all, what has this meant for the needs? We see a record global appeal for in terms of humanitarian funding that has been asked for, particularly by the UN, but of course for the UN and its partners. So many challenges in terms of an increase in needs. What does this say to you? How do you react to this? I mean, it seems that, yeah, as I said, needs are skyrocketing, and there's no end to this. Is there a response? What is the response you would give to this?
Yeah, well, what struck me when I read your question and the way you ask it is one, first, before getting into financing, which is that in a way COVID has changed our mindset. We used to be the helpers, and then we would go to places, and now suddenly it's a little bit like the climate conversation. It's really global, i.e. if we don't fix the COVID issue with countries from the global south, especially the ones in crisis, then we are going to be in trouble ourselves. And that changed somehow the way we look at our business. I think there is a tremendous risk that we forget about other needs of people and health and COVID-related issues. I think we have seen that in terms of violence, SGBV, but also marginalization, exclusion, the things are going in the wrong way. And what's clear, seen from a Swiss perspective, but also looking at how our partners, our fellow donors react, we can be lucky if we don't get less money than what we were having in 19, I would say, because 20 there was a peak, there was a hype. I mean it in a positive sense, but look at what's happening in the UK. We, the Swiss, will remain stable, but there's no way we can put an additional hundreds of millions in that. So I think one trend that is positive, if you look at COVAX, at ways and means of addressing the needs, we see that we enter perhaps a more relevant and useful conversation and also practice in terms of nexus, in terms of giving a chance to local actors, to local settings, regional arrangements, but it won't compensate. I think beyond the humanitarian dimension, the fact that for the first time in decades, poverty will increase, that's really bad news. And so there may be partial responses, but the actual fix, I think, won't come on the short term.
And how should then humanitarians react to this, in the sense that exactly with this expansion in needs, there's always more to do, so to speak. But there may also be the temptation to do more than we perhaps should do, in the sense that, you could also say, well, actually, there's a specific task or a set of needs that are particularly for humanitarian organizations to address. Other needs, and you already mentioned the nexus, should be addressed by development actors or other actors as such. How do we make that a reality? And how do we, in that sense, ensure that humanitarian actors perhaps focus more on what is specifically humanitarian?
Well, I think you raise a very important question. It seems to me that we still have a lot of room for reducing the cost and also investing in what's really necessary for the most vulnerable ones, the people in need. And I think in this respect that we simply if those monies really went to the right places and to the right people, instead of traveling around, instead of having one additional conference, we put this money into it. Or there are systems, the way we function, that run against subsidiarity. What we could have competent enough in place from a development source, from local actors, from regional actors, we tend to like to have it international. And I would assume that it won't compensate for the increase in the needs. But if we, so to say, really ask ourselves, are we needed? How can we support others who are in a better place? And where can we exercise, so to say, restraint, i.e. say, okay, we won't engage, we will try to allocate our limited resources in a more meaningful way. Also, I think that there's more to do at supporting responders, the people who in the case of a natural disaster, but also in situations of conflict, respond and they do it in a way that could be enhanced, demultiplied, if we were smarter at the ways of engaging with the groups, with the people, with, in some cases, local government, whoever is there and is doing a reasonably good job. And then the other thing is, I think risk averseness is something we have to take into account. It's true that we have limitations, we need to be accountable, but on the other hand, sometimes I think transaction costs become much too high just for the sake of not taking a risk. So in other words, if we stick to what's really at the core humanitarian, emergencies, conflicts, the ones who are immediately in need, and we try to go for the best solution and the more economical solution under certain circumstances in a context, and we might compensate to a certain extent.
One thing I hear you say, but correct me if I'm wrong, Philippe, is that so one way forward perhaps is to focus more or to get more of a discussion on organizational strength, comparative advantages, complementarity in that sense. One problem that we're coming across in our work particularly is that there is no incentive for a UN agency or for an international NGO to step back. The incentive is exactly, of course, involved in getting involved as such. But what you're saying is perhaps we should recognize at some point our limitations. Do you have any thoughts on how we can address this issue in terms of the fact that the incentive system seems to, work in the wrong direction, so to speak?
Yeah, and it has for a while. So I think we donors carry quite an important responsibility in this. We tend not to be coherent and consistent in our ways. I think we, like for instance, under the Grand Bargain, we have been involved and still are in the good humanitarian donorship. We are trying to address ways, to show ways that are most promising, that give the best value also in terms of serving the interests of the people for the limited money we have. I think it's a long-term process, and it's also a bit of a race against time. I think within our system, many people realize that we have to change our ways, and including within UN organizations and also the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. But we are in a way too slow faced with the trends. However, I would think whatever coalitions, pragmatic on what works best, creating also incentives towards delivering in the right way, like things like, okay, in terms of human resources, who gets promoted, who gets a good posting, and for what reasons, and also within the UN system, we have seen this with the GHRP. On the one hand, it was an interesting effort, and then the next day, we, as Switzerland and others, were getting messages from heads of agencies, please think of us first. And we haven't managed, it could be, for instance, a topic within the OCHA donor support group. We haven't managed to develop a common narrative and a common reaction to those trends. So again, a lot of potential, but largely unexploited, unfortunately.
Brings me to my last question in that sense, because precisely, and fortunately, I would say some donors, of course, particularly in the context of COVID-19 and the global appeal, said, well, actually, we need to look at flexible funding, perhaps multi-year, and particularly it needs also to be unrestricted, because obviously this pandemic is multifaceted as such. Still, I would say, as donors, you have a significant influence, and perhaps to some degree, I would say, rightly so, in terms of, ensuring, well, having a voice in how humanitarian priorities are set, so to speak. For the coming year, let's say, where do you think the main priorities are? Because particularly COVID, it's a health crisis, it's an education crisis, schools are closed, it's a food security crisis. How should this decision making and this dialogue take place? Where should it take place?
Yeah, well, I don't think we will manage to align ourselves and harmonize ourselves. I would say, again, it's a combination of things we can do. We can hopefully have a slightly more meaningful humanitarian aid segment of the ECOSOC. We could have other types of conversations within the ODSG, and hopefully the Netherlands there can really lead us onto a more fruitful path. I think we should overcome this kind of constant confrontation with agencies, us saying you have to prioritize, and they're saying, okay, you tell us, for instance, GBV is so important to you, but you don't fund it. So in this respect, a more candid conversation, more evidence, perhaps more shocking evidence, being a little bit more daring about self-evaluation, reviewing what's actually happening. There is this constant issue of what we say in different conferences and what we actually do in the field. And let's face it, in a way, COVID is a revealing factor. It's an enhancer of issues we don't manage to address in an appropriate way. So at least we can try, because of this element of globality, COVID is a global issue, and therefore we better address it. The level of self-interest is higher. So perhaps we can make use of this instead of this kind of sometimes empty talk around being principled, facing the notion that, yes, this time, even from a humanitarian perspective, we are in the same boat. And then try and engage in a way that at least mitigates the consequences as much as we can do. But the real fix, it's much beyond the humanitarians. It's the Security Council, it's the power games, it's the cynicism of international politics, and us, the humanitarians, having great issues with calling a spade within our respective administrations. If you take CT and all the influence on humanitarian delivery, the terms and conditions of delivery, it's not in our hands, but we are very shy when it comes to confronting our own colleagues with the notion that the types of measures we take run against first the objectives we set ourselves, and then our results, and also against the interests of the most vulnerable ones we want to address, to accompany, to assist.
Philippe Besson, thank you very much. Your contribution will certainly help us further in that dialogue, and let's hope this is a conference where we will not only say what we're going to do, but also in fact that will be followed up by meaningful action. Thank you very much for sharing these very important points with us. I'm sure we will continue discussing them in the coming days, and I'm sure we'll also continue to discuss them with with Switzerland as a humanitarian donor. Thank you so much.
Many thanks, Ed. It was a pleasure, and all the very best. Be in touch. Bye-bye then.